The system will explode in 60 seconds. The voice was small, almost fragile, yet it sliced through the billion-dollar lab like a crack in glass. And for a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Because in a place where machines roared and egos echoed louder, silence like that didn't belong. And yet it settled heavy in the air, pressing down on polished marble floors and gleaming chrome surfaces that reflected the cold white lights above. Lights that had watched genius after genius fail for weeks, watched millions of dollars burn into. Frustration watched Harrison Blackwell, billionaire, visionary, a man who bent industries to his will, lose control of the one thing he could not dominate. And now the countdown blinked in ruthless red across the screen. 59, 58, 57, each number a reminder that even power had limits, that even money could not buy another second once time decided to move. But Harrison only smirked, his voice low and edged with arrogance. "Then let it," he said, as if defiance alone could rewrite reality, as if the machine, his legacy, his $2 billion promise to the world, would bow to his will the way everything else always had. And around him, engineers in tailored suits shifted uneasily, their degrees suddenly feeling like decorations instead of weapons, their silence louder than any alarm, because they had tried everything, recalibrated every circuit, rewritten every line of code, chased every theory until it collapsed into nothing, and still the machine refused to live. Still it stood there like a monument to failure, humming softly as if mocking them all. And in the far corner of the room, nearly swallowed by shadows and stainless steel, stood Emily Carter, a small girl in a faded blue dress, her blonde hair tied back with a simple ribbon that had lost its color from too many washes, her hands resting lightly on the edge of a janitor's cart. The scent of lemon cleaner clinging to the air around her like a quiet signature of a life that wasn't supposed to be noticed. A life that moved through spaces like this without ever being seen, because her mother, Sarah Carter, knew the rules of this world too well, knew that survival depended on silence, on invisibility, on never stepping out of line. And so she worked with practiced precision, wiping surfaces that cost more than her entire apartment, her movements careful, her eyes down, her presence erased. But Emily's eyes were not down. They were fixed on the machine, watching, listening, tracing something no one else seemed to notice, something hidden beneath the noise and the panic and the pride, something quiet and persistent, like a whisper waiting to be heard. And as the countdown dropped to 45, 44, 43, the tension thickened, wrapping around the room like a tightening wire, until one of the engineers let out a nervous laugh, glancing toward the corner, toward the girl who wasn't supposed to exist in their world. "Unless the maid's kid can save us," he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery, and a few others joined in, their laughter brittle and sharp, a reflex to fear disguised as humor, because it was easier to laugh than to admit they were out of answers, easier to dismiss her than to question themselves. But Emily didn't laugh, didn't flinch, didn't look away, because in her world, being unseen meant you learned to see everything, and what she saw now wasn't a broken machine, wasn't a failure, it was a pattern, a rhythm, a loop repeating itself over and over again, a system listening to its own echo until it collapsed under the weight of its reflection. And as the countdown hit 30 seconds, the room began to fracture under pressure, voices rising, commands overlapping, desperation seeping into every word. But Emily stepped forward, just one step, small but impossible to ignore, her voice steady, calm in a way that didn't belong to a child. "You're not fixing it," she said softly, her words almost swallowed by the chaos. And yet somehow they landed, cutting through everything. "You're making it worse." The laughter did not last long, because something in her voice did not match the room. It was not loud. It was not desperate. It was certain, and certainty in a place built on ego was dangerous. So the nearest engineer frowned, shaking his head as if dismissing a glitch in the system. "Kid, step back," he said, already turning away, already choosing not to hear her. But the countdown kept falling, 29, 28, 27, and the machine let out a low, uneven hum that vibrated through the floor like a warning. No one wanted to translate. While Sarah Carter froze mid-motion, her hand gripping the cleaning cloth tighter than before, her eyes flickering toward her daughter with quiet panic, because this was the line you never crossed. This was the rule that kept food on the table and a roof overhead. You do not speak. You do not interrupt. You do not exist. But Emily did not step back. She stepped forward again, one more inch into a world that had never made space for her. Her gaze locked onto the main console, watching the feedback loops flicker in patterns that were invisible to everyone else. Patterns that felt less like code and more like a conversation the machine was having with itself, repeating, amplifying, collapsing. And then Harrison Blackwell turned, slowly, deliberately, his sharp eyes settling on her for the first time, not as a shadow, not as part of the background, but as a disruption. And there was a pause, just long enough for the room to feel it, just long enough for power to shift its attention. "You think you understand something my engineers do not?" he asked, his voice calm but edged, the kind of calm that tested, measured, judged, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with clarity. "It is not failing," she said, her words precise. "It is repeating." And a few of the engineers scoffed under their breath, the idea too simple to be taken seriously, because complexity was their language, not simplicity. And yet the countdown dropped to 20, 19, 18, and no one else was speaking. No one else had an answer. So silence began to stretch, uncomfortable and heavy, until Harrison's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest crack in his certainty. "Explain," he said. And it was not permission, it was a challenge. But Emily did not explain. She moved, her small hand reaching toward the console, hesitating for only a fraction of a second, as if crossing an invisible boundary that had been drawn long before she was born. And behind her, Sarah whispered under her breath, "Emily, do not." But the words came too late, because Emily's fingers were already hovering over the controls, her eyes scanning the data streams one last time, confirming what she already knew, that the machine was not broken. It was listening to its own signal, amplifying it until it drowned in noise, and all it needed was silence, just one moment of silence. And as the countdown hit 12, 11, 10, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every person caught between disbelief and desperation, between pride and the possibility that the smallest voice in the room might be the only one that mattered. And Emily pressed a single command, not to fix, not to rebuild, but to interrupt, to cut the loop at its source. And for a split second, everything went dark, the hum vanished, the screens flickered, and then the machine inhaled, steady, controlled, alive in a way it had never been before. And the countdown froze, suspended in time, as if even the system itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. And no one spoke, because in that silence, something far more powerful than the machine had just shifted. No one moved, because movement would have meant admitting that something impossible had just happened. And in a room built on certainty, impossibility was not welcome. It was not acceptable. It was something to be explained away, reduced, controlled. But the machine stood there in perfect silence, no longer trembling, no longer fighting itself, its systems flowing smoothly across the screens in calm, steady lines that had not appeared once in the past 6 weeks. And that calm was louder than any alarm, louder than any failure. It was proof, undeniable and immediate. And Harrison Blackwell felt it before he allowed himself to understand it. That subtle shift beneath his feet, the moment when control slips from the hands that have always held it, and his eyes narrowed slightly, studying the console, then the data, then finally the small figure standing in front of it, as if trying to reconcile two realities that refused to align, because this was not how the world worked, not his world, not the world where expertise was measured in degrees and experience was counted in decades. Not the world where a child standing beside a cleaning cart rewrote the outcome of a $2 billion failure with a single quiet decision. And yet there it was, undeniable. And around him, the engineers began to stir, their silence cracking into whispers, into hurried checks of the system, into disbelief disguised as analysis, fingers moving quickly across tablets and keyboards, searching for an error that would restore their understanding of reality. But every test came back the same, stable, consistent, functioning, and the truth began to settle in, uncomfortable and heavy, while Sarah Carter stood frozen a few steps behind, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on her daughter, not with pride at first, but with fear, because she understood something the others did not. She understood the cost of being seen in a place like this, the risk of stepping out of invisibility, the danger of breaking a rule that had protected them for years. And yet Emily stood still, her hands now resting quietly at her sides, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had simply finished a small task, her gaze no longer on the machine but somewhere distant, calm, grounded, untouched by the tension that still gripped the room. And Harrison took a slow step forward, then another, his expensive shoes echoing softly against the marble floor, each step deliberate, measured, as though approaching something fragile, something that could not be forced into explanation. And when he stopped in front of her, the room seemed to shrink around them, all attention narrowing to a single point, a single question that carried more weight than any command he had ever given. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and Emily looked up at him, her expression simple, unguarded, almost curious, as if the answer was not something remarkable, but something obvious, something anyone could have seen if they had chosen to look. "It was not broken," she said again, gently. It was listening to itself, and there was no pride in her tone, no need for recognition, just truth, clear and steady. And Harrison held her gaze for a moment longer than expected, as if searching for something deeper, something hidden. But what he found instead was something far more unsettling, the realization that nothing had been hidden at all, that the answer had been there the entire time, overlooked not because it was complex, but because it was simple, and simplicity did not belong in a room like this, not when everyone was too busy proving how much they knew to notice what they were missing. And behind him, one of the senior engineers finally spoke, his voice tight, controlled. "Sir, the system is fully operational." And that confirmation echoed through the room like a verdict, sealing what no one wanted to say out loud, that the smallest voice had solved what the greatest minds could not. And in that moment, the hierarchy that had defined everything in that space shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, undeniably, like a foundation settling into a new shape. And Harrison exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, before speaking again, this time not to the room, not to his team, but to her. "Stay," he said, a single word, simple, but carrying a weight that changed everything. And for the first time since she stepped forward, Emily hesitated. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, simple yet heavy, as if the entire room was waiting to see whether it would be obeyed or ignored. And Emily felt it settle on her shoulders, not like an order, but like a door opening into a world she had only ever observed from the edges. And for a brief second, she glanced back at her mother, because even now, even after everything, the rules still lived inside her. The quiet instructions whispered over years: stay small, stay unseen, stay safe. And Sarah Carter met her daughter's eyes with something that trembled between fear and something new, something uncertain, because the room had changed, the people had changed, and perhaps the rules no longer held the same power. But fear does not disappear in a single moment. It lingers, it asks questions, it reminds you of every time stepping forward came with a cost. And so Sarah gave the smallest shake of her head, almost invisible, almost automatic. But Emily turned back anyway, because something else had taken root, something stronger than fear, something built not on defiance but on clarity. And Harrison Blackwell noticed the hesitation, the silent exchange, the invisible line that separated their worlds. And for the first time in a long time, he did not push, he did not command, he waited. And waiting was not something he was known for. But this moment was different, because control had already slipped once, and forcing it back would not restore what had been lost. So he adjusted slightly, his voice lower, measured. "You saw something my team did not," he said, not as a question, not as praise, but as a fact that needed to be acknowledged. And around them, the engineers stood still, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet unease, because recognition of that truth meant confronting something uncomfortable. That knowledge was not always tied to status, that insight could come from places they had never thought to look. And Emily took a small breath, steadying herself, not because she was afraid of speaking, but because she understood now that words in this room carried weight. They shaped what came next, and she chose them carefully. You were trying to control it, she said softly, but it needed space. And the simplicity of her answer seemed to land harder than anything complex ever could, because it did not challenge their intelligence. It challenged their approach, their assumptions, their need to dominate instead of understand. And Harrison listened, really listened, his expression shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that something inside him had moved, something that rarely did. And behind him, one of the senior engineers cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly as if trying to reclaim some part of the ground that had been lost. Sir, we should run a full diagnostic before making any decisions, he said, his tone controlled, professional, but laced with the need to re-establish order, to return things to a structure he recognized. But Harrison did not look away from Emily, did not break the connection that had formed in that quiet exchange, and after a brief pause, he nodded once, not to the engineer, but to her, as if confirming something unspoken, and then he spoke again, his voice carrying across the room with a clarity that silenced any remaining whispers. Cancel the diagnostics, he said, and the words rippled through the space like a shift in gravity, unexpected, undeniable. If it works, we move forward. And that decision, simple and absolute, did more than acknowledge success. It validated it. It placed trust where none had existed before, and for the engineers, it was a moment that forced recalibration, not of the machine, but of their place within the system, because for the first time, the hierarchy had bent, not broken, but bent enough to reveal that it was not as fixed as they had believed, and Emily stood there, still and composed, as the room began to move again, conversations restarting, systems being monitored, but everything felt different now, quieter, more aware, as if the space itself had learned something it could not unlearn, and Harrison finally stepped back, giving her space in a way that was both intentional and unfamiliar, his gaze lingering for just a second longer before turning away, but not dismissively, not as before, and as he walked toward the center of the lab, his voice carried once more, this time directed to the entire room. Find out why it worked, he said, and though it sounded like an order, it felt more like a question, one that no longer had an obvious answer. And in the corner, beside the janitor's cart that had not moved, Emily remained where she was, not stepping further in, not stepping back out, standing precisely at the line where everything had changed, and for the first time, she did not look like she was trying to disappear. The room did not return to what it was, because once something unseen becomes visible, it cannot be unseen again, and the quiet shift that settled over the lab was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, woven into the way voices lowered, the way movement slowed, the way people began to look twice instead of once, as if recalibrating not just the machine, but themselves. And Emily could feel it without needing to understand it fully. The difference between being ignored and being noticed was not just in the eyes that now glanced her way. It was in the space around her. The invisible boundary that had once kept her at the edges now felt thinner, uncertain, as though it no longer knew where to stand. And across the room, engineers gathered in small clusters, their earlier confidence replaced by careful analysis, not of the system, but of the moment, replaying it in their minds, searching for logic that would make it fit into what they believed about expertise and authority. But logic did not come easily when it required admitting that they had overlooked something simple, something clear, something right in front of them. And Harrison Blackwell stood at the center of it all, not speaking, not directing, just watching, his gaze moving from the stabilized machine to the data streams. Then briefly, almost instinctively, back to Emily, as if confirming she was still there, as if the answer might disappear if he looked away too long. And for a man who built his world on certainty, this quiet uncertainty was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome, because somewhere beneath the layers of control and expectation, there was a recognition, small but undeniable, that something valuable had just entered the room, something that did not fit the usual mold, and that made it worth paying attention to. And near the back, Sarah Carter finally exhaled a breath she had been holding for far too long, her shoulders lowering slightly, though her hands still held the cleaning cloth as if it were an anchor, because even now, even after everything, she was not sure what came next, not sure if this moment would open a door or quietly close one, as so many had before, But when she looked at her daughter now, she did not see someone trying to disappear. She saw someone standing still in her own place, and that difference, small as it seemed, carried more weight than anything else in the room. And as the minutes passed, the machine continued to run smoothly, its steady rhythm becoming a quiet confirmation that this was not luck, not an accident, but something real, something repeatable, something that could not be dismissed. And that realization slowly worked its way through the space, settling into every conversation, every glance, every silent acknowledgement, until one of the younger engineers, hesitant but unable to hold back his curiosity, stepped a little closer to Emily, his tone softer now, stripped of the earlier mockery. "How did you see it so fast?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried a shift in perspective, because it was not dismissing her anymore. It was asking, and Emily looked at him for a moment, not with pride, not with hesitation, but with the same calm clarity that had guided her from the beginning. "I was not trying to fix it," she said. "I was trying to understand it." And those words landed differently this time, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, and the engineer nodded slowly, as if realizing something he had not considered before, that understanding and control were not the same thing. And across the room, Harrison heard it, every word, and though he did not turn, did not interrupt, there was a subtle shift in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that the lesson being spoken was not just for the engineers, it was for him as well. And in that moment, without announcement or declaration, the foundation of the room changed again, not in who held power, but in how it was defined, and Emily, still standing beside the janitor's cart that had once marked her place in the background, now stood at the center of something new, something unspoken but undeniable, and for the first time, no one looked away. Time did not rush forward after that moment. It stretched, as if the room itself needed to adjust to a new rhythm, one that was no longer driven by urgency or ego, but by something quieter, something more deliberate, and Harrison Blackwell remained still at the center of it, his presence no longer dominating the space in the same way, but anchoring it, observing rather than commanding. And that shift did not go unnoticed, because for the people who had worked under him for years, silence from him was more powerful than any order. And now that silence carried a different weight, not pressure, but consideration, and slowly, he turned again, his attention returning to Emily, not as a problem to solve, not as an anomaly to dismiss, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And for a man who built empires by understanding variables, this realization was not uncomfortable, it was necessary. "Walk with me," he said, his voice calm, steady, not loud, yet it reached every corner of the room, and the invitation in those words was unmistakable, not a command, not a test, but something closer to recognition. And Emily hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, leaving the janitor's cart behind, leaving the invisible boundary that had once defined her place. And as she moved, the room seemed to shift again, not dramatically, but in the way eyes followed her path, in the way conversations paused just slightly, as if everyone understood that something important was unfolding, even if they could not yet name it. And Harrison led her toward the central console, the heart of the machine that had consumed weeks of effort and expectation. And when they reached it, he stopped, turning slightly to face her, giving her space rather than closing it, a subtle gesture that spoke louder than any acknowledgement. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes understanding does not begin with words. It begins with observation, and Harrison looked at the system, then back at her. "Show me," he said. And this time, it was not a challenge, it was a request, and Emily nodded gently, her small hands moving toward the interface with quiet confidence, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. And as she began to trace the system's behavior, pointing out the looping signals, the feedback amplification, the way the machine was responding not to external input but to its own echo, her explanation remained simple, clear, almost effortless, and that simplicity carried its own authority because it did not try to impress. It simply revealed, and the engineers who had gathered at a distance now found themselves drawn closer, not out of obligation, but curiosity, listening in a way they had not before, not waiting to correct, not preparing to argue, but trying to understand. and as Emily spoke, something subtle shifted again, not just in the room, but in the people within it, because the hierarchy that once defined who taught and who learned had blurred, if only for a moment. And Harrison listened more closely than anyone, his focus unwavering, his mind not resisting the explanation but adapting to it, reshaping its own assumptions in real time. And when she finished, there was a brief pause, not empty, but full, filled with the quiet recognition that something fundamental had been revealed, and Harrison exhaled slowly, nodding once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. "We made it too complicated," he said, almost to himself, and that admission, simple as it was, carried a rare kind of strength, because it did not defend the past, it accepted it. And Emily looked at the machine again, then back at him, her voice soft but certain. "It just needed someone to listen," she said, and for a moment, no one responded, because the truth in those words extended beyond the machine, beyond the system, beyond the problem they had just solved, and Harrison understood that, even if he did not say it out loud. And as he straightened slightly, his voice returning with quiet clarity, he spoke not just to her, but to the room. "We are not done here," he said, and though the machine was running, though the crisis had passed, it was clear that something much larger had just begun. The words lingered in the air long after he spoke them, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy with intention, because when a man like Harrison Blackwell said they were not done, it did not mean more work. It meant something deeper, something structural, and the room felt it, a quiet awareness that what had just happened was not an ending. It was a beginning, and the engineers, who moments ago had been focused only on solving a problem, now found themselves facing a different kind of challenge, one that did not involve code or circuits, but perspective, and that shift was uncomfortable, because it required letting go of certainty, of hierarchy, of the invisible lines that had always told them where they stood and why. And Emily stood there beside the console, her small presence now impossible to ignore, not because she demanded attention, but because the truth she carried had already changed the outcome. And across the polished floor, Sarah Carter watched quietly, her hands no longer moving, the cloth in her grip forgotten, because she understood something no one else did, that this moment would echo far beyond this room, that it would follow them home, into every choice, every opportunity, every risk, and she was not sure whether to feel relief or fear, because both lived side by side when life began to change. And Harrison turned once more, his gaze sweeping across his team, not with disappointment, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, expectation. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, one that did not demand answers but invited reflection. "We spent weeks trying to force a solution," he said, his words measured, deliberate, "and we ignored the simplest signal in front of us. And no one interrupted, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to defend, only a quiet recognition that he was right. And that recognition settled into the room like a new foundation, subtle but firm. And one of the senior engineers shifted slightly, his posture less rigid now, his expression thoughtful rather than certain, as if something inside him had begun to rearrange. And Emily watched it all without speaking, her eyes moving from the machine to the people, observing the way understanding moved through them, slow but real. And Harrison turned back to her once more, not as a leader addressing someone beneath him, but as a man acknowledging a voice he had not heard before. "Where did you learn to see like that?" he asked, and the question was not about skill, it was about perspective, about the kind of awareness that could not be taught in a classroom or written in a manual. And Emily paused for a moment, not searching for an answer, but choosing how to say it, because some truths are simple but not always easy to hear. "I had to," she said quietly. "When no one listens to you, you learn to listen to everything else." And the words landed softly, but their meaning spread through the room with quiet force, because they did not just explain her. They reflected something back to everyone there, something they had not considered, that sometimes the ability to see clearly comes not from privilege, but from necessity. And Harrison absorbed that without looking away, without dismissing it. And for a brief moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not erased, but changed, and he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just her answer, but the truth behind it. And then he turned again, addressing the room with a clarity that carried both authority and something new, something earned in that moment. "We are going to rebuild this system," he said. "But this time, we do not start with control, we start with understanding." And the statement was simple, but it shifted the direction of everything that would follow. And as the team began to move again, not with urgency, but with intention, Emily remained where she was, no longer at the edge, no longer trying to disappear, but not fully stepping forward either. Standing in that quiet space between what had been and what was coming next, and for the first time, that space felt like it belonged to her. The room did not erupt into applause. It did not celebrate, because what had just happened demanded something quieter, something deeper than reaction. It demanded reflection, and that reflection moved slowly through the people in the lab, settling into their posture, their tone, their silence, as they began to return to their stations not with urgency, but with a kind of careful awareness, as if every action now carried weight, as if every assumption had to be reconsidered before it was trusted again. And Emily could feel that shift without anyone needing to explain it. The way the space around her no longer pushed her away, the way no one told her to step back, the way the air itself seemed to hold her presence instead of ignoring it. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing in the wrong place. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, even if she did not yet understand why. And across the room, Harrison Blackwell stood with his hands resting lightly behind his back, watching as his team began to work again. But this time, something in their movements had changed. They were not rushing to prove themselves. They were slowing down to understand, tracing signals instead of overriding them, listening instead of commanding. And that difference, subtle but real, began to reshape the entire rhythm of the lab. And Harrison noticed it, not with surprise, but with quiet approval, because transformation rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself in small, consistent changes, and this was the beginning of one. And after a moment, he turned once more toward Emily, his gaze steady, no longer questioning her presence but accepting it. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different kind of authority, one that did not come from power alone, but from recognition. "You changed how this room thinks," he said, not as praise, but as a statement of fact. And Emily blinked slightly, not expecting the weight of those words, not because she doubted what had happened, but because she had never seen her actions reflected back to her in that way before. And she lowered her eyes for a brief moment, not out of discomfort, but out of thought, because understanding something and being seen for it were not the same thing. And this was new. And behind her, Sarah Carter took a cautious step forward, drawn by something she could not ignore anymore. Her voice soft, respectful, but steady. "Sir, if there is nothing else, we should return to work," she said. The words familiar, practiced, a return to the structure she understood. But Harrison did not immediately respond, his attention still on Emily, as if weighing something that extended beyond the moment, beyond the machine, beyond the immediate success. And when he finally spoke, it was not to dismiss them, not to send them back into invisibility, but to shift the direction entirely. "Your work is not finished," he said, his eyes moving briefly to Sarah, then back to Emily. "Not here." And the implication in those words was clear, but not fully defined, and that uncertainty hung between them, quiet but significant, because it suggested something more than acknowledgement, something more than gratitude. It suggested possibility. And Emily looked up again, meeting his gaze with the same calm clarity that had guided her from the beginning, not asking, not assuming, simply waiting, because sometimes the next step reveals itself not through urgency, but through patience. And Harrison nodded once, as if confirming a decision that had already taken shape in his mind. And then he turned slightly, addressing the room once more, his voice carrying across the lab with measured precision. "Effective immediately, this project changes direction," he said, and the words landed with quiet force, because they did not just affect the system, they affected everyone involved in it. "We build it to understand first, not to control." And there was no resistance this time, no hesitation. Only a collective pause as the meaning settled in, because something had shifted too deeply to be ignored. And as the team began to adjust, to reorganize, to rethink their approach, Emily stood still for just a moment longer, taking in the space that had once excluded her and now, in its own quiet way, was making room, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was borrowing that space. She felt like she had earned it, even if no one said it out loud. The shift did not end with words, it deepened with action, because once a new direction is spoken in a room like this, it demands to be proven, and the engineers, now quieter, more deliberate, began to move differently, not chasing solutions, but tracing understanding, their screens filled not with frantic corrections, but with careful observation. And in the center of it all, Emily stood beside the console, no longer an outsider looking in, but not yet fully part of the system either, existing. In that rare space where something new is forming, and Harrison Blackwell watched it unfold with a focus that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with recognition. Because what he had built was powerful, but what he had just witnessed was something else entirely, something that could not be manufactured or purchased, only noticed, and that realization did not weaken him, it sharpened him. Because the greatest strength he had ever possessed was not certainty, it was adaptation. And now he was adapting again, and across the lab, one of the senior engineers approached cautiously, his earlier authority softened into curiosity. "Sir, if we restructure the signal processing the way she described, we can stabilize long-term performance," he said, his tone respectful, but different now, because he was not just reporting, he was acknowledging a source that had not existed in his world before, and Harrison nodded slightly, not as approval, but as alignment, because the idea was no longer about ownership, it was about direction. And Emily listened quietly, her eyes following the conversation not as an observer, but as someone who understood its meaning without needing to claim it. And that quiet presence began to influence more than just the machine. It influenced the way people spoke, the way they paused before dismissing an idea, the way they listened just a little longer than they used to. And Sarah Carter saw it all from just a few steps away, her heart still carrying the weight of uncertainty, because moments like this could change everything or disappear just as quickly. And she had lived long enough to know that not every door that opened stayed open. But when she looked at her daughter now, she did not see hesitation, she saw steadiness. And that steadiness gave her something she had not felt in a long time, a quiet kind of hope. And Harrison turned again, this time not to the machine, not to the engineers, but directly to Emily, his expression thoughtful, measured, as if he was considering not just what had happened, but what it meant going forward. "You see patterns differently," he said, not asking, not assuming, simply stating what had become clear, and Emily nodded once, gently. "I listened first," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer carried the same weight it had before, because it was not a technique, it was a perspective, and Harrison absorbed that without interruption, without correction. And after a brief pause, he made a decision, not announced with urgency, but spoken with quiet certainty. "You are not here by accident," he said, his voice steady, reaching only as far as it needed to. "And we are not going to treat this like one." And the words settled into the room with a kind of permanence, because they were not about the machine anymore. They were about her place within this space, and that place, once undefined, was beginning to take shape, and the engineers, hearing it, did not resist, did not question, because the evidence was already in front of them, undeniable and immediate, and Emily stood still for a moment, letting the meaning of those words settle, not rushing to respond, not trying to step into something she did not yet understand, because she had learned that understanding comes before movement. And as the lab continued to shift around her, slowly aligning with a new way of thinking, she remained centered, grounded, aware, and for the first time, the space that once felt distant and unreachable now felt like something she could walk into, not because she was invited, but because she belonged there all along, even if no one had seen it until now. The decision did not echo loudly. It settled, like something inevitable finally spoken into existence, and the room absorbed it without resistance, because by now, resistance no longer made sense, not after what they had seen, not after what had been proven in the quietest way possible. And Harrison Blackwell stepped closer to the console again, his presence no longer casting a shadow over the room, but aligning with it, part of a system that was beginning to think differently. And as he looked at the stabilized data streams, the smooth, uninterrupted flow of information that had once been chaos. He understood something that went beyond engineering, beyond systems, beyond even success. He understood that control had limits, but understanding did not. And that realization carried a kind of clarity he had not felt in years, and behind him, the engineers were no longer waiting for instruction. They were already adjusting their models, their frameworks, their assumptions, integrating what they had learned into every layer of the system. And the shift was no longer subtle. It was visible in the way collaboration replaced competition, in the way questions replaced conclusions, and Emily stood at the center of it all, not directing, not claiming, simply existing within the change she had initiated, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had always belonged in this space even when no one had acknowledged it. And Sarah Carter watched her daughter with a quiet stillness, the fear that had once held her back now mixing with something else, something unfamiliar but undeniable, pride. And it did not come from the machine being fixed, it came from seeing her daughter stand without shrinking, without apologizing for being seen. And that was something no system could measure. And Harrison turned once more, his attention returning to Emily, not as a question this time, not as an evaluation, but as a recognition of something that needed to be addressed, something that could not be left undefined. "You said you listened first," he began, his voice calm, deliberate. "That is not something we can teach easily." And there was a pause, not because he was unsure, but because he understood the weight of what he was about to say. And in a room where decisions shaped futures, words like these were not spoken lightly. "But it is something we need." And the statement hung there, clear and unambiguous, because it was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, not because she did not understand, but because she did not rush to define it. She allowed the moment to unfold, the same way she had allowed the system to reveal itself. And Harrison nodded slightly, as if confirming what he already knew. "I want you to stay," he said, his tone steady, not as an order, not as a favor, but as an invitation rooted in necessity. "Not as a visitor," he added, making the distinction clear, "as part of this." And for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, not with tension this time, but with anticipation, because everyone understood what those words meant, even if they did not fully grasp how it would take shape. And Sarah's breath caught quietly behind them, the weight of that offer pressing against everything she had known, everything she had taught her daughter about staying safe, about staying invisible. And now the world was asking something different, asking her to step forward instead of back. And Emily stood still, absorbing it, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, simply present, because she had learned that moments like this were not about reacting. They were about understanding. And after a quiet pause, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I do not know how to be part of this," she said. And the honesty in her words did not weaken the moment, it strengthened it, because it left space for something real to form. And Harrison's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in agreement. "Then we will figure it out," he replied. And in that simple exchange, something new took root, not just a decision, not just an opportunity, but a beginning that did not rely on hierarchy or expectation, but on understanding. And as the lab continued to move around them, adjusting, evolving, aligning with a new way of thinking, Emily remained where she was, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, but not yet fully defined, standing at the threshold of something that had not existed before. And for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like a limitation. It felt like possibility. The moment did not demand an answer immediately. It lingered, allowing space for something deeper to form. And Emily stood there quietly, not overwhelmed by the offer, not rushing to accept or refuse, because she understood something that many in that room were only beginning to learn, that the most important decisions are not made in haste. They are made in clarity, and clarity requires time. And Harrison Blackwell did not interrupt that silence, did not push for a response, because for the first time, he recognized that control was not the path forward here. Understanding was, and understanding could not be forced. And around them, the lab continued to move with a new rhythm, engineers exchanging ideas with a different tone, their voices lower, more thoughtful, less certain but more open. as if the system they were rebuilding was not just the machine, but the way they approached problems altogether. And Sarah Carter stepped closer now, her presence no longer confined to the edges. Her posture still careful, still respectful, but no longer shrinking, because something had changed in her as well, something that came from seeing her daughter stand in a place she had always believed was out of reach. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, though soft. "Emily has responsibilities," she said, not as resistance, but as truth. "School, home. Our life is not here." And her words carried weight, because they grounded the moment in reality, in the world beyond the glass walls and polished floors, a world where opportunities were not always simple, where change came with consequences. And Harrison listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful, not dismissing her concern, because he understood something about responsibility, about the cost of decisions. Even if his world had often shielded him from their harsher edges. And Emily looked at her mother, really looked this time, seeing not just the worry, but the care behind it, the years of quiet sacrifice that had shaped every choice, every boundary, every rule she had been taught. And for a moment, the room faded. The machine, the engineers, the billionaire, all of it became background to something more important. The connection between them, the unspoken understanding that whatever came next would affect both of them, not just her. And Emily took a small breath, grounding herself in that truth, before turning back to Harrison, her voice calm, steady. "I do not want to leave her," she said, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, because that was not a question for her. It was a certainty, and Harrison nodded slowly, not surprised, not challenged, but acknowledging the clarity of her priority. And in that moment, he adjusted, not the situation, but his approach, because adaptation meant listening, and listening meant responding to what was real, not what was convenient. "You will not have to," he said, his voice measured, offering not a solution yet, but a direction. And the room seemed to pause again, not with tension, but with attention, because what he was about to shape would define more than just an opportunity. It would define whether this moment became something lasting or something temporary. And Emily held his gaze, not with expectation, but with quiet presence, allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. And Harrison continued, "If you are part of this, then we make space for your world, not the other way around." And the statement carried a different kind of weight, because it was not just an offer, it was a shift in structure, a willingness to bend a system that had never been designed to include someone like her. And Sarah felt it immediately, the significance of those words settling into her understanding, because this was not about pulling her daughter into a world that would reshape her. It was about reshaping that world to make room for her. And that difference mattered. It changed everything. And Emily absorbed it quietly, not reacting with excitement, not stepping forward impulsively, but understanding what it meant, the responsibility, the possibility, the unknown. And for a moment, she said nothing. Because sometimes silence is not hesitation, it is respect for the weight of a decision. And in that silence, the lab continued to move. The system continued to run. The future continued to take shape. And Emily stood at the center of it, no longer invisible, no longer uncertain, but not yet fully decided. And for the first time, that space between knowing and choosing felt like something she was allowed to stand in. Without pressure, without fear, just possibility. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, as if everything that needed to be said had already settled into place. And Emily stood there with a calm that did not come from certainty, but from understanding, because she knew now that this moment was not about choosing between two worlds, it was about allowing them to exist together. And that realization changed the weight of the decision entirely. And she looked at her mother again, not for permission, not for approval, but for connection, for the quiet bond that had guided every step of her life. And Sarah met her gaze with something that had grown stronger than fear, trust, because she had seen what her daughter could do, not just in fixing a machine, but in standing still when it mattered, in speaking when it counted. And that kind of strength did not come from chance. It came from who she was. And Sarah nodded slowly, a small movement, but one that carried years of understanding behind it. And Emily turned back, her posture steady, her voice soft but clear. "Then I will stay," she said, not as a declaration, but as a continuation of everything that had already begun, and the words did not echo. They settled, becoming part of the room, part of the system, part of the future that was now taking shape, and Harrison Blackwell did not react with surprise or celebration. He simply nodded, once, as if confirming what he had already expected, because by now, the direction of this moment was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable, and he stepped slightly aside, not to lead, but to make space, a gesture that would have gone unnoticed before, but now carried meaning, because space, in a place like this, was not given lightly, and the engineers, watching quietly, understood it too, not in words, but in the shift they felt, the recognition that something fundamental had changed, not just in the system they were building, but in the structure around them. And Emily moved forward, not hesitantly, not boldly, but naturally, as if she had always been meant to take that step. And as she reached the console again, the machine continued to run, steady and responsive, its signals clear, its patterns open, no longer trapped in a loop of its own making. And there was something almost symbolic in that, something that reflected more than just code, something that spoke to the way systems and people could change when they stopped trying to control and started trying to understand. And Harrison watched it all with a quiet awareness, his earlier certainty replaced not by doubt, but by something stronger, perspective, because what he had built before was powerful, but what he was building now had the potential to be something more, something that did not just function, but evolved, and that difference mattered. And across the room, Sarah Carter stood a little taller, her presence no longer hidden in the background, because she had not just brought her daughter into this space, she had supported her in stepping into it, and that support, though quiet, had shaped everything that followed. And as the lab continued to move, adapting, aligning, growing into its new direction, the atmosphere shifted into something steady, something grounded, no longer driven by urgency or pride, but by purpose. And Emily remained at the center of it, not as an exception, not as a surprise, but as a part of the system itself, integrated, valued, and understood. And in that moment, without announcement, without ceremony, the story of that room changed, from one defined by control and hierarchy, to one shaped by awareness and possibility. And the difference was not loud, but it was lasting. The lab did not return to the way it used to be, and that was the quiet truth no one needed to say out loud, because it lived in the details now, in the way voices softened before interrupting, in the way questions were asked before conclusions were made, in the way a room that once measured worth by titles and salaries had learned, slowly but unmistakably, to recognize something far less visible and far more valuable. And Emily Carter stood at the center of that change without ever trying to own it, her small hands moving across the console with the same calm focus, her presence no longer surprising, no longer questioned, but simply accepted as part of the rhythm. And Harrison Blackwell watched from a distance that was no longer about hierarchy, but perspective, understanding now that leadership was not always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it was about knowing when to listen, and that lesson, simple as it sounded, had taken a moment like this to fully reveal itself. And across the polished floor, Sarah Carter moved quietly once more, but she was not invisible anymore, not to him, not to the room, because once someone has been seen, truly seen, they cannot be reduced to the background again. And that recognition changed the way she stood, the way she carried herself, subtle but real, like a weight that had finally been lifted without anyone needing to name it. And the machine, still running smoothly, became something more than a success. It became a reminder, a quiet symbol of what happens when control gives way to understanding, when assumption gives way to attention, when someone who was overlooked is finally allowed to be heard. And in that space, something new had taken root, not just a better system, but a better way of seeing. And Harrison turned once more, his voice calm, steady, not directed at anyone in particular, but carrying across the room with quiet clarity. "We almost missed it," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only reflection, because the truth was not about blame, it was about awareness, and that awareness settled into the room like a lesson that would not be forgotten. And Emily glanced up for a brief moment, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting anything more, just present, as she had been from the beginning. And that presence, steady and unshaken, spoke louder than anything else because it was not shaped by the room. It was what had reshaped it, and the future of that lab, of that machine, of the people within it, would carry that moment forward in ways they could not yet fully see, but would continue to feel in every decision, every question, every pause before speaking. And as the day moved quietly on, no applause, no announcement, just work continuing with a different kind of awareness, one simple truth remained, woven into the foundation of everything that followed. That true value does not arrive with a title. It does not announce itself with status. It reveals itself in the moments when no one is looking, and it waits, patiently, for someone willing enough to finally see it.